Hey everyone, excuse my comfy shorts, but feels really good to wear these when I'm working, so please accept my apology. Anyways, we have a A2337 MacBook Air here. It's a M1 Mac. We are replacing the screen on. The screen is cracked. And so here I'm just taking the screws out and releasing the clips. And the next thing we need to do is disconnect the battery connector here. And this has a small little latch that you can pop out with a spudger. And once you pop it up, the connector should pull up and off. This is a little bit different from previous generation battery connectors, at least that I've worked on the most. So it's kind of interesting. Here I am disconnecting the battery connector and prying it up out of the way so it doesn't make contact with the board again. Now I'm working on removing the plate that holds down the screen connector. Using some non-conductive tweezers to take the plate off. And we're going to disconnect the cable now. I use my fingernail for this just because I can feel the amount of pressure I'm applying to these connectors because they are delicate. Now I'm taking the screw out of the Wi-Fi antenna and Bluetooth antenna plate cover. This just holds the connectors down onto the board so they don't pop off. I have a special way of taking these out. You have to be really careful with these connections. They're easy to damage and mess up. So what I usually do is I'll take the spudger with the tip and I will pry it underneath the part of the cable that's further at the back, and it'll pop off the board pretty easy and it won't damage anything, as shown here. Alright, first one's popped off. I'll pry it back a little bit so it's out of the way. Second connector will do the same. Just wiggle it under the cable at the back and it'll pop off. And now we're disconnected. Here I am removing the two screws that hold the screen board down to the chassis. Something I'd really like to mention here is while you're removing that screw or putting it back in next to the screen connector when it's off, just be careful, because if you slip off that screw and you damage that cable or the connector on the board, especially if the screen's still good, you could really mess things up, and this repair just got way more difficult. So just use extra caution when you're working around connectors or electric components that are exposed. You can save yourself a lot of heartache. So here we're removing the screws for the actual antenna now. Something I'd like to mention on this particular model is that the antenna is glued down. It's glued pretty well, and in the middle there, a part of the antenna actually presses down into the chassis of the laptop and has little rivet looking pieces that hold it down in there, so it really snaps kind of down in. So you have to be careful. You know, the other ones I've taken apart didn't have that. At least the older models. Next we have to remove these 6 screws that actually hold the screen hinge to the chassis. And these are rather large screws, and when you're doing this you have to be careful of this little board to the right here. That board is very close to these hinges and you could easily damage it if you're not careful while you're taking them out. So just use extra caution whenever you're taking these screws out and you have the screen loose, that you don't accidentally pry against that board when you're taking it off, because you can break it and that can prevent the computer from booting if that board gets damaged. So here I'm just loosening the screws on the screen hinges. I'm actually loosening them and then kind of re-snugging them again. That way I will be able to undo those screws with one hand whenever I get ready to remove the screen. That's just kind of a process I've changed over time. It just makes it easier whenever you're trying to hold on to the screen with one hand and you're taking the screws out with the other. If you haven't broken loose the Loctite on those screws, trying to do it one hand can become quite a challenge, and to me it's more risk because you have a better chance of slipping and knocking components off the board or damaging the audio jack board to the right. And so yeah, as you can see here, I'm just able to take those screws out with one hand pretty easy since I already had loosened them some. And with my left hand, you can't see, I'm supporting the screen below. And so now after the screws are out, you just tip the screen back a little bit and just keep an eye on that board to the right, and the screen just kind of pops out of that little pocket. And after that, there you go. Screen is removed. It's sad the screen's broken because it looks perfect. It's interesting how those things break. Here is the new screen now. So I'm just taking off the tape here that holds the screen board down. You need to be really careful here. That tape is stuck pretty good there and you can't just rip it off because those little ribbon cables are pretty delicate, and if you tear those, it's pretty hard to repair. Especially the video cables, if you tear those, they have very, very, very tiny traces, and might as well just get another screen after that if you tear those. So just use super extra caution here when you're doing this. They do that just for shipping, so it doesn't get damaged on the way here. And here I'm taking off just a little styrofoam back plate just to protect it, keep it from rubbing against the screen. Next thing we got to do is bend the hinges where they need to be in the right position. I usually just use my tool here in one of the screw holes to bend the hinge out where it needs to be. I essentially just match it like the screen on the old screen that I took off. Just match the angle, and that way it should go back in the way that the other screen came out. So now I'm bringing the laptop back over here and going to reinstall the same way. Now you need to pay close attention to the screen connectors here while you're doing this. And while you're holding the screen, try not to put a bunch of pressure on the actual screen portion. Try to hold it around the frame if you can. And before you place it on there, you need to grab the ribbon cables and hold on to them whenever you put them back, because if you aren't careful and you put it on there, you could tear them, or if they get sandwiched in between the screen and the case while you're trying to put the hinges back on, you can damage it. So I always just hold the cables with my right hand and kind of let it drop in there once I have it close to where it needs to be. And now it's just a matter of lightly adjusting, getting the screen to settle in place. And just again, pay close attention to that board. You can see there's a little bit of movement you have once the screen's in there, and the clearance to that board is very, very small. So just use extra caution. And now I'm going to hold the screen with my left hand in place once I get it lined up. And I'll use my right hand to get the tool and the screws and start installing them. And here all I usually do is I just put one screw in the hinge and just kind of snug it a little bit. That way I can kind of, see how things are and see if everything's aligned right, at least enough to where I can close the screen. So you have to be careful too, like whenever I bend the screen now, once it's connected, make sure it doesn't bind up, or make sure the ribbon cables don't bind up in any way. So I always watch really closely when I'm closing them, just to make sure that, nothing's going to break or anything bad's going to happen. So now that the screen's closed, we can go ahead and connect the screen connector. And I'm only doing this now just to test the screen before I go to the trouble of putting everything else back in. It's good to test a new screen before you go to the trouble of reassembling the whole thing, just because it would be really unfortunate if you put it all back together, put the back on, and you turn it on and then find out there's a problem with the new screen. So I just made the connection there, and we're going to reconnect the battery and power the laptop on just to check to make sure the new screen's working. So now that the screen looks to be working, we're going to close it back, turn it off, and make our final adjustments. So as you remember, before we do anything, need to pull the battery connector off again. And now we're going to disconnect the screen connector. Now we're going to reinstall the antenna. You must disconnect the screen connector before you reinstall the antenna, because it will not be able to go in there, because the screen connector goes over the top of the antenna once it's in place. So now we're just going to adjust the screen and make sure that it's in the proper alignment and put the screws back in, put all 6 back in. And this time we will tighten everything down nice and tight. And now we will reconnect the antenna here. You do have to kind of fish the screen ribbon cables and board through the antenna, so you just be careful. Don't yank or pry really hard. Just remember those cables are very delicate. And let's go ahead and reconnect the screen. So I like to connect the screen cable this way before I secure the screen board down, because to me it's easier to snap the connector in whenever I can kind of pick it up some and look at it from an angle. It's easier to move around a little bit too to get it to line up right, and you can just feel it better with your hand as opposed to trying to make the connection when the board's secure. If you press down and it's off a little bit, you can really damage that connector because they are not very strong. So once the screen connector is made, then I just put it in place and hold it with my left finger and put the 2 retaining screws back in and hold it. And this is the one that's close to the screen connector, so just be careful around it. Make sure you don't slip. And just check to make sure they're torqued down. You know, they don't need to be super tight, just snug. And now we will install the screws for the actual antenna. Now we can reconnect the antenna coax cables. These I just like to apply with my fingernail, so I use my finger and align it in place. I don't press down hard or anything like that. You can kind of just feel whenever it's in the right place before you snap it down. And I just use my fingernail to click it on there. It makes an audible click usually whenever it's connected. And once that's connected, now we can put the retaining plate back. It's just one single screw for that one. And after that, we can put the screen connector plate back on, which holds the screen connector down and in place, keeps it from popping out. And now we can reconnect the battery. Make sure that the little snap connector on there, little latch, is in place. And here we go. Now it's time to put the back plate back on. These have some funny connectors, so I always kind of rub the back like this. That kind of helps them snap into place without applying a ton of pressure. And now we'll just put the back cover screws back in. And every model seems like have different size screws, and so you just have to pay attention to the lengths of them whenever you first take them out in the beginning to know where they need to go. Usually at the back of the laptop, that's where the long screws go, and the shorter screws will be, you know, on the sides and in the front, but it does vary between models, so just pay close attention to that. Now we'll peel off the protective layer. I stuck it on the old screen to protect it because I may use that one again. And that's it. It's ready to go. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.